Welcome to Learning Photography with Duck. Here's your host, Duck.
Alrighty, I guess we're going to try this one more time. Again, guys, I really am sorry about this very clumsy start for today's session. I don't know what happened. My video card, I guess, was just being stressed too much. Didn't want to deal with all this craziness that's going on. So anyways, today is our Lightroom session. And what I want to discuss today is the recent upgrade that was made to Lightroom, which expands on the local adjustments, and local adjustments being anything you do to a very specific area of your image without it affecting other parts, all right? And of course, I just launched Lightroom and I'm seeing my screen flicker. So, yeah, it's going to be one of those days. I can already tell. All right. So, we'll see if we can do this with the minimum amount of issues. Okay. Let me switch over to screen share. There we go. All right. Okay. There we go. Hopefully everybody can see Lightroom. Say yes?
Yes.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you. Beautiful. All right. So if you have not updated to the latest release, you're actually, let's take a poll by round of yes or no's. How many of you have updated to the latest version already? Yes?
Yes.
No? Bob has? Okay.
Jill has not.
Jill has not. Okay. All right. So some of you have not. Natalie says she has not. All right. One thing I'm going to warn you. All right. Before you do your update, or you upgrade to the latest version, do a catalog backup. Okay. Typically, when you close out Lightroom, it'll ask you if you want to back up. Sometimes, if you have it set to an automatic backup, all right, you'll want to back it up, because what's going to happen when you say yes, upgrade to the latest version, it's going to upgrade the your library database. All right, because it's got to make room for all the new features that they've added on. All right, so just make sure you do a backup first. All right.
Yeah.
Yes.
Does it give you a new because one of the last times I updated, it gave me a whole new library.
Yes, it does. All right.
Okay.
So the way it works, you have to understand that the library is a database. All right. And just like any database, it needs some place to put data into. So, for example, if you have a database of names and addresses and phone numbers, you're going to have an entry for the first name, an entry for last name, one for the address, one for the city, state, zip code, phone number, etc. So you're going to have a field for each one of these places where you're going to put data into. Whenever Adobe comes out with a new release that has new features, it's going to require some place to put that data into it. So if they're not reusing a field that's already there, So, for example, back in version 3, when they switched from version 3 to version 4, it wasn't called exposure, lights, or highlights, shadows, whites and darks. It was called, I can't even remember, it was so long ago. It was named something different, right? But what they did is they basically kept the features the same. They just renamed them, and they reworked the way they were presented in the user interface. So they really weren't adding new data, right? They added new data in other areas. But every time they roll out any major changes where they need to have a new placeholder for this data, they're going to upgrade the Lightroom catalog. And what they do is they basically take your old catalog, make a copy of it, rename it. In this case, they basically just append whatever name your catalog currently is. It's going to take that and just append it with a underscore V11, so version 11. Okay. And they add the necessary fields into that database according to the new upgrade. Okay. So in essence, you're going to have, you're now going to have two databases. Okay. And the reason you want a backup is in case something happens during the upgrade and it wasn't able to successfully upgrade, it can corrupt not only the new database that it's moving into, but on occasion it has happened where it will corrupt the old database as well. They've been really, really good. I've never had a problem. I very rarely hear of anybody having problems in upgrading, but again, it's always safer to make the backup, and it's safer to make a backup and not need it than to not have a backup and need it. Okay. That's the old adage. All right. So make sure you back it up first. All right. And then normally what I suggest is after a few months, 3, 4, 5, 6 months down the road, when you know that everything is working fine with the current database, at that point, go back and delete the old one or archive it somewhere. You don't need it taking up a lot of space, right? And while you're at it, see what else is hanging out in there. You might want to just get rid of even older databases, which is probably what I need to do because I haven't cleaned out that area in quite a while. All right. So let's take a look at this new feature. Okay. So I have here, let me just limit these down to, I made a few selections of some of the images that I want to just use for today's lesson. Okay. When you go into the first thing you're going to notice is right below the histogram, and give this a chance to catch up. There we go. Right below the histogram, you're going to notice that the local adjustment tools, all right, the local adjustment tools are now a little different. Okay. It looks a little bit more simplified, and it's going to look a little bit strange in relation to what you were used to before. All right, but you're going to notice that there's the first one is still the same. Okay, the first one is our crop tool. Okay, that's still the same. That hasn't changed. Okay, it's pretty much everything else after that. The second tool, which is our spot healing, spot removal, that hasn't changed either. The icon changed, but the tool itself really hasn't changed. Okay, and then the eye reduction. I've never had a need for this tool. I remember, like I said, way back, even version 3, it was always kind of like a joke among Lightroom users is why it's even there, because nobody, seems to even use it. But it's there, okay? Where all the changes have happened is in this last little icon right here, right? What's gone, what's not visible here is the circular and linear gradients and the brush tool, right? Those are not visible. That doesn't mean that they're not there. If we click on that last icon, all right, you're going to get this new pop-out window here. Okay, and it becomes a little tricky because the tools that you're normally used to seeing aren't quite evident. All right, it's not, this isn't a very intuitive interface, and I'm hoping that eventually down the road it does become intuitive, but right now it's really not that intuitive, right? But actually you'll see in this, I probably shouldn't have used this example because this example already has a mask already in place, which is actually a rollover from a mask that I applied previously, and I believe, it was a Luminance Range mask, okay? But if you see this big plus symbol right here, the big plus, all right, that's where all these tools are hidden, okay? And you're going to notice that there are two, you're gonna see, can I do this with, all right, I can't. All right, you're going to see you still have your brush, you still have your linear gradient, and you still have your radial gradient with the same shortcut keys. All right, so you can access these through your shortcut key just like you would before. All right, but there's a slight change. The first thing you notice is that at the very top, we have two new entries, which is the select subject and select sky. And this is, of course, using Adobe's Sensei, which is Adobe's AI, to handle these selections. And I've played with them, and let me tell you, it's pretty impressive how accurate these selections can be, which is going to make your editing so much faster, okay? So those two are new. And then at the bottom, we're going to see color range, luminance range, and depth range, all right? Now, previously, we've had these, but they were attached to the individual tools. All right. So if you opened up your brush tool in the previous version, and you went down to the bottom of the panel, you can modify your selection based on color range, luminosity range, or depth range. Now, the thing with depth range is it only works with cameras that have LiDAR features built into it. And that's typically cell phones. DSLRs, very, very few DSLRs have that it's called LiDARs. Basically, it's a depth perception, and it creates what's called a depth map. And a depth map is basically just gray shades where it uses shades of gray to let the system know how close or how far away an object is. Right? So the closer something is, the brighter that feature is in the map. And then the further away, it becomes darker. So it's able to use that for cameras that have that feature in it. Otherwise, it's going to be pretty much grayed out. You're not going to see it. Okay? But the nice thing about it is that it's now separated the color range and the luminance range out from the individual tools and made it their own tools. So I think this is a big step, because rather than playing around with luminosity masks and color range masks for the individual tools, we now have it as a standalone tool in the masking tool. Okay. All right. So how does this work? All right. Well, first of all, any questions on on where to find it? No questions. All right. Let me switch that I know doesn't have any selections. Okay. So when you come to edit an image and you want to use some masks, all right. As with any edit, the first thing you want to do is you want to analyze what it is that you want to change. All right. So in this particular image, I have a landscape. This is one that we took with Robert up in Kent. For those of you who went to Kent with us, right? And it was a very it wasn't a bad day, but you can see it wasn't the greatest day as far as skies are concerned. It was pretty gray sky. So more than likely, if I'm not able to recover anything from the sky, I will want to bring it into Adobe Photoshop and do a sky replacement there. But before I do that, I want to spend a little time here and see if I can recover any of it. All right. So the first thing I'm going to do to test it is I'm going to bring my exposure. If I bring that down, the first thing I notice is that, yes, indeed, there is actually detail in that sky. All right. Now, as you can see, I have to drop it down a lot. Okay. And because I want to target just the sky, I don't want to deal with anything else. All right. This is a good place to start looking at local adjustment tools. All right. So now that makes it very obvious for me is I'm targeting the sky. Well, the nice thing about it is that, let me reset this. When I go into my masking tool, brings up my toolbar, all right, and right off the top, I see select sky. All right, so I'm going to select the sky, and it creates a mask for me. All right, and you can see it's black. Black means it hides everything in that effect, all right? And it takes a second, and you'll notice that it updates. It does a light update. Oop, what did I press? Okay. does a live update, and now you can see a little representation of the mask. Okay. And right underneath there's a little checkbox that says Show Overlay. All right. And there's a little box that allows you to pick what color you want for an overlay. Okay. So you can pick, green. All right. And you pick how opaque you want that. Now, by default, it's usually red. Simply because it tends to contrast very nicely with a lot of the images. But just keep in mind, if you're working on an image that has a lot of red already in it, that mask is going to get lost. So you might want to pick something that doesn't contrast, all right? So in this particular case, we have some red in the trees, nothing heavy, all right? And then, of course, we have the red bridge. All right, so maybe switching over to a green. All right, and not just any green, but this sick chartreuse green that doesn't match anything you're seeing. All right, and you say, well, maybe I got a lot of green in my landscape. All right, we can override it, and we can say, all right, I want something that to be jarringly different than anything that's in my image. That way I know exactly where my mask is. All right, so you can make adjustments for it. Of course, you can control the opacity. All right, and if your eyes are like mine, you'll probably push the opacity up on that. Okay, so that way you can see that mask really, really clearly. Okay. And obviously, you'll want to use the mask to make sure that you're getting a proper selection. All right. Once you have your selection, all right, because you can see, it did a really, really, really great job at selecting that sky area. All right. And even around the trees, it did a really beautiful masking job in and around the leaves. This little tree over on the left-hand side, all right, it did a great job. Okay. Once I verify that my mask is in place, I'll go ahead and check that off, because at this point, and my screen's not catching up. We'll give my screen a chance to catch up here. Because at this point, is when I want to start working with my local adjustments. All right. So I don't want that mask color influencing any adjustments that I make. So I will take the show overlay off. All right. The nice thing about it is if at any time you want to see what the system is, what the overlay is covering, you could either hover over this little icon here. Oops. Of course, it disappears when that little icon there. If you hover over it, it's going to show you the mask. And then you hover away, it'll hide the mask. Or you can use the letter O, and on your keyboard, toggle the mask on and off. O for overlay. All right. So if I press the letter O, it turns the mask on, so you can see it. Toggle it off, it turns it off. All right. And yeah, my video is slow today, isn't it? So, little side note, I went shopping for a graphics card. They're almost impossible to find. I can't find a graphics card for my system. Every time I do, it says out of stock. So, all right. So anyhow, once I have that mask selected and I like the selection, I'll go ahead and make my adjustments. So in this case, I'm probably going to bring my exposure down. I might cool it off because I want to bring some of that blue in. And all right, you can see. Give it a second to catch up here. Once I bring my exposure down, all right, you're going to notice that the exposure is going to darken everything in the sky. And because everything's pretty much from the mid-tones to the brights, we're going to lose a little bit of the contrast simply because there was no contrast in the sky to begin with. If you saw the original image, it's pretty bleak looking. If you're not aware that the detail's there, you probably say, oh, that sky's gone. All right. From experience, I know a little bit better. And I knew that there was at least something recoverable there. All right. So I bring it down. All right. But all my, what should be white puffy clouds are now very gray. So it looks kind of stormy. So I'm going to take my highlights and lights up. Right? Just a little bit more separation between the whiteness of the clouds and the darkness of the shadow areas of the clouds. Okay. Now, if you notice, it's a little wonky in comparison to the light in the rest of the image. All right, because I've darkened my sky so much, it now looks out of place in relation to everything else. All right, but the nice thing is, because I have this mask that separates my sky from the rest of the image, I know I can balance this out. Okay, so I have my selection. I'm going to go ahead and close out of this. Bring my global exposure down on my overall scene. Maybe a little bit, all right. And because it was a global exposure change, global, all right, it also affected the sky. I can come back to that sky, all right, and I can light it up. Okay. Now it's starting to match a little better. There we go. Okay. Maybe add a little saturation, vibrance, a little more contrast, and really pop. Maybe even increase the exposure overall. Okay. So now I've brought detail out from this rather bland sky. And I was able to, within a couple of slider moves, balance out the sky with my ground. All right. So global adjustment, darken everything up, go back to the mask and brighten it up. Okay. Any questions on how to access the masks and just get a basic sky mask? Any questions so far? We good? Okay.
Good. And I saw one thing. There's a button there where you can flip the selection. Like you can pick your sky and then flip it so you can have your mask on everything else.
Yes, you can.
I thought that was kind of neat.
Okay. It's a little it's a little what you call unintuitive. Okay. With flipping masks. All right. In this particular case, yeah. All right. We have the invert. With some of the other tools, it's not this easy. Okay. All right. So it makes me think that whoever worked on this may have been a landscape photographer. They definitely made this useful for landscape photographers. All right. So let's say I wanted to have a mask just for the ground area. All right. I can come up here, and if you notice on the in my mask, it has the mask preview, the little icon here, and directly below it, it says Sky 1. All right, so this is my sky replacement, or my sky selection. Okay. Now the nice thing is, just like in Photoshop, we can double click on the label, and we can relabel it if we wanted to. So we can call that sky. All right. And obviously this is Sky 1. All right. And then on the right-hand side, you're going to see a series of ellipses and an eyeball. The eyeball basically just turns, it's like Photoshop, turns the visibility off and on. If you want to double check how or what it's affecting in your image. Okay. Any modifications you make to that mask is going to fall underneath it. You can see that there's a little down arrow right next to it. Okay. Anytime you make modifications to your mask, it's going to add it underneath that mask, right? So in one way, it's in this particular case, it's different than Photoshop, because whenever you make modifications to a mask in Photoshop, you're doing it directly onto the mask, because we're interacting with the mask in a totally uniquely different way in Lightroom. We don't exactly work directly on the mask. All right. Any changes we make to appends another modification to the mask. All right. So, for example, we started off, the mask was completely black, meaning that we can see through the mask to the underlying layers. All right. And to that mask, we added an effect, in an essence, you can say. And that was the selection of the sky. All right. That was the first thing we did. Okay. If at any point you say, well, you know what? We did these changes to the sky, I might want to add those very same changes to the water. All right. Probably not going to look good for this particular image, but let's just pretend that's what we want to do. All right. So now we have two additional buttons here. One that says add, one that says subtract. And I think it's pretty obvious what they do. One will add to your existing mask. The other one will subtract from your existing mask. Okay. So in this case, we're going to add. And when you click on it, you're going to be presented with what is it that you want to add to this particular mask. All right. And in this case, I'm going to add a brush effect. All right. So I'm going to click on the brush. All right. And you can see I now have my brush tool. Okay. Hopefully you can see it. I have it against the sky there. Okay. And the panel all the way on the right-hand side, all right, should look very familiar. This is the panel that is usually at the very bottom of your radial filter, your linear filter, and of course your brush filter, right? And you have the two sizes. You can have two presets, so you can have like one small brush and one large brush, for example. And then just by selecting these two, you can switch back and forth, right? And then all the way on the right-hand side, you can see that the word erase isn't accessible, all right? Because if you want to erase from the mask, you have to use the subtract, okay? So in essence, what we are doing is we are adding something to the mask, okay? We're, in this case, all right? So, like previously, we can control how much of a feather we have on the edge of our brush, how much flow, and how much density. All right. So flow is how much of that brush effect gets applied in one stroke, and how much, and the density is kind of like opacity. How opaque is it? Okay. And then, of course, you also have your auto mask, which uses that edge contrast detection to kind of keep you within a certain boundary. All right. So I'm going to turn my auto mask off because I really don't need to use it. Okay. And as I paint, because there is already an effect applied to this mask, all right, which is our brings the exposure down, adds a little bit of cooling, brings the highlights up. You can see that it's really making a big change to that water. All right. Mind you, I already warned you, this is probably not going to look good because it's not quite the thing that I would do to it, but just to show you what this brush can do. It allows you to really paint in a localized area. Oops, what happened? Okay. Now, you can see that this particular effect makes this look horrendous. All right. This is not how I would approach this. All right. Simply because now that I've selected a separate area that is now attached to the settings for my sky, I cannot control those two separately. All right. So this is not the way to do it. I want you to see how you can very easily add to an existing selection. And you can see now here we have another little addition called Brush 1. And if I hover, you can see how it's highlighted. Okay. This represents what I have added. All right. And then if you look at the icon of it that represents our mask, you can see the cumulative effect on that mask layer, right? But each one of these is an independent selection, right? Under a common parent. All right, so any changes you make to a mask is going to be made to the parent, not the children that you apply underneath it, okay? Hopefully that makes sense, all right? And of course, you can disable the view to see if that's what you want to do. Okay. Now at any point, you can click on these ellipses, all right? Or you can just right click. It's going to bring up the same context menu, all right? Of course, you can rename your layers and not only your master layer, but your child layers, all right? You can convert it from an add subtract, okay? And this, it doesn't make any sense to do that because it's a separate area. And you can invert it, all right? And this will play later on in certain areas, okay? You can also do Boolean, what are called Boolean modifications, all right? Where you intersect, right? I haven't played very much with this, all right? So I'm not 100% familiar with this, but I think it's just going to be adding more modifications to the master, all right? You can duplicate things. You can obviously hide it, but you can do that just with the eyeball, all right? And of course, you can delete it. And if you want to bring from one to another, all right? If you want to bring, for example, if you want to bring this selection of the river and apply it to another mask, you can just copy it from here, go to your other mask and paste it in there, okay? So it's a nice way of being able to move certain things around, right? In this particular case, it's not doing anything for my image, so I'm just going to go ahead and say delete brush 1, right? And we're back to our original. Okay? All right. I'm going to add a second one here, all right? And this time, instead of using any of the standard ones, I'm going to come down and I'm going to do a color range, all right? Now, if you've never used the color range or the luminosity range is pretty cool. Actually, you know what? Let me just do this one, all right? So I've made a new mask, okay? And you can see that right now it's black, meaning it's going to show through the mask. Nothing's being applied, right? White reveals, black hides, right? And then right below it, we have one called New Color Range, okay? And it's grayed out because we now, at this point, need to tell Lightroom what color are you looking to target, okay? So as soon as I come over to my image, you're going to see a eyedropper, all right? But this is a little bit unintuitive, all right? Because it's not a matter of clicking on colors, all right? So if you're familiar with this tool in Photoshop, Photoshop gives you the eyedropper, which allows you to make your initial color selection. And then you can switch over to another eyedropper that lets you add to that selection. This doesn't quite work in the same way, and I kind of wish they would make it work the same way. This works by creating a marquee selection. So I'm going to go to my bridge. I want to pick this red. I want to modify it and make it less orange and more red. So I click and drag, all right, and you can see that it creates a marquee selection, all right, and it may require a couple of tries until you get used to this tool, all right? But you want to make a big enough selection that you know it's going to create a broad enough range, okay? And then, of course, once I've made my selection, it's going to apply the mask based on anything that it finds that closely resembles that color, that kind of like reddish orange, right? And as you can see, my overlay is that kind of like magenta purple, magenta color, all right? So everything that is magenta is being selected, which makes sense because after all, this is a fall photo. There's going to be a lot of red, all right? Also, red is one of those, well, I should say orange, because that's literally the color of this bridge. Orange is one of those selections that is visible in nature all over the place, okay? You're going to find it in skin tones. You're going to find it in anything that is brown. So any wood items is going to have a lot of red in it. And of course, we have foliage that is turning reds and oranges. So obviously, it's finding all that. Okay. So how do we control this? All right. So if we go to the drop down on the right hand side panel, right, here is our color range it's sampled, right? So we got the sample. And right below it, we have it's the refine slider, right? And by default, it'll usually land at 50%. Okay. If we move that down towards the left, all right, it's going to selection left, right? Meaning it's going to restrict the number of oranges from from a wide association now to a more controlled, closer association to that orangey red. Okay, and you're going to want to make sure that everything that you want to have selected is still selected. You don't want to start losing it. So like here, all the way to the right-hand side of our bridge, I'm starting to see that I'm already starting to lose some of that that selection. Okay, so if I want to make sure that everything's selected, I just bring it back to the right-hand side, and right about there, I'm comfortable with that. Okay. But you can see that we also have sections of our trees that are still selected. Not a problem. We can do one of two things at this point. We can say, okay, if I make changes to my bridge, all right, I'm going to modify that orangey red. I want to make it more red, less orange. If I do that to the trees as well, is it going to be horrible? Maybe, maybe not. All right. So rather than spending a lot of time cleaning up my mask, I might just play around with this. So I'm going to turn my show overlay off. I'm going to come down to my panel, right? And I'm going to go to my hue slider. I'm going to see a little bit red, okay? So maybe use fine adjustment. Go. That's looking good. And of course, there's my little toggle here. I can toggle that off, all right, and on. That's going to toggle all my effects, all right? Or we can go right to the mask and say, okay, toggle it off, toggle it on. So you can see it's a slight color shift. It made it a little bit redder. All right. Let's give the screen a chance to catch up for you guys. All right, but it's a slight shift, but it's a significant shift because now it's a red bridge rather than a orangey red bridge, right? And because these spots in the trees and the foliage, in comparison to the overall scene, wasn't that influential, I'm not really noticing that drastic of a color shift in the trees, right? So if anything, it may have helped, okay? And if I want, all right, at this point, I can come back to my mask, to my color range, and I can say, well, let's see, maybe I want more into the trees, okay? So you show my overlay, and you know what? A little pop of red, I can actually definitely see it here in this tree behind the opening of the bridge, and you can definitely see this in the tree behind the bridge on the far shore. All right, so I don't mind it having affected those areas. It actually works in this particular case. Okay, but let's say you look at it and says, "Ooh, I don't like what it did to those areas." We can very easily go. I'll turn my show overlay back on. We can just go right up to here, all right? Just like before, we have the add and subtract. In this case, I'm going to subtract from my my mask, all right? And how do I want to subtract? Well, I'm going to use the brush because I want to selectively pick what I want to add and subtract. So I'm going to use the brush, all right? And again, we have the AB, so we can switch between small and large, all right? Control the feather, control the flow. And if I brush over these areas, you can see that the overlay, that magenta color starts disappearing from my mask, okay? We got a lot in the shadow here, all right? So you can refine your mask very easily just by using the local brush. Right? Here we're getting into a larger area. So I'm going to go with a larger brush. And of course, I'm overworking my graphics card. There we go. And I'm going to rename this to say bridge. Okay. All right. So typically, when I do local adjustments in Lightroom, I often don't go too crazy with masks. So renaming them, yes, often than not, I can just look at that little representation, that little icon, and just by looking at it, I can see what areas in the image are being targeted. All right. Where I start labeling my layers is when I have multiple layers that look very similar, but are doing different things. So in order to not get lost at that point, I'll start labeling my layers, right? But if my layer stack is very simple, I'm not going to bother, okay? All right. My screen's got to catch up for you guys, I think, right? You're still seeing a lot of purple in those trees? In the mask?
I'm not. No.
Oh, no, we'll catch up. All right, so it's just on my end. All right. Oh, there it goes. Okay. All right. Any questions on this is just a very brief introduction to using these masks. We're good so far? All right. So we used the sky replace, or not sky replacement, the sky selection. All right. And you saw how nice of a job it did. Okay. We used a color range. All right. Okay. The other thing that we can do, and let me just switch images just to do something new. Okay. The other thing we can do is we can do a luminance range. Okay. Luminance range. Now, if you've used the luminance range with any of the tools previously, you're going to notice that there's a big change in the way it's displayed here. All right, the luminance range now has kind of like this box right here. Right, where before there used to be two sliders. Right, one was range and the other one was fuzziness. Okay. Range means how much of a certain luminosity you want, and the fuzziness was the edge transition between what you select and what you do not select. Right. So, for example, if you're making a manual mask in Photoshop using a brush, if you use a hard edge brush, you're going to get a hard transition between what you select and what you don't select, right? And if you use a soft brush, you're going to get a soft transition between what you select and you don't select. That transition, the hardness and softness, is the fuzziness, all right? Anywhere you paint white on a black mask, that's your actual selection, all right? But we're not, in that particular case, we're not selecting based on range, but more on, where we're painting, all right? Where range comes into play is we have a range of luminosity that, remember, we're dealing, the underlying structure is we're dealing with shades of gray on 3 channels, red, blue, and green, all right? So we have everything going from solid white to solid black, and everything in the middle is a range of grays, right? So the range basically is saying, all right, how much of that brightness or darkness do you want to select, right? So in this particular case, we're going from 0, 0 on the left to 100% on the right. All right. And this represents 0 meaning no luminosity. All right. So 0 brightness all the way to 100% brightness, which would be solid white. All right. So 0 brightness is black. 100% is white. Okay. So now just like the color range, we can use our eyedropper to select a luminosity range, right? And in this case, I'm going to select the sky. All right, I know we have a sky selection, but just for this example, I'm going to select the sky. And I'm going to select a very large marquee area. Okay. And you'll notice that it selected everything that matches that luminosity level. And now if we look at our grid on in the panel on the right, it has changed. What we have here, all right, are two little, and let me make it a little bit bigger here. We have two little arrows on the bottom, right? This represents the full range of luminosity, okay? And we have this square here that represents the brightness of the area of our selection. All right. So everything in this square represents our range. Everything beyond that is the fuzziness, right? So it blends nicely, right? Otherwise, we get very hard transitions, right? So if I were to bring this in, right? Actually, you can see it along this. Let me zoom in real quick here. See how very mottled this looks, all right? And as I bring it in closer, all right, now we have a very hard line between the luminosity of the white line and the luminosity of this road. All right, so if I turn off the overlay, all right, we can see that that's yellow. That's very, very bright in compared to the gray of the road. It's a very hard, defined line. And of course, if I bring it even closer and closer and closer, okay, that definition gets even harder. Okay, so rather than have a hard transition, which is going to make it look like you obviously applied a mask, we want to soften those edges. We want to keep the transition of our effect to integrate with the rest of the image in a natural way. And for that, we're going to use the fuzziness slider. Oops. Okay, that fuzziness slider. This allows us to kind of blend in, you may say, with its surroundings. Okay? All right, so let me, hang on. Okay. So now we can say, okay, all right, we've selected all this stuff in the windows, all right. The majority of this house here is selected because it meets the same luminosity. Okay. All right. And we can make modifications to how much we want to select. Okay. And just like any mask, we can say, okay, I want to exclude certain areas, right? And we're going to use the subtract, all right? And you can say, okay, I'm going to use the brush, or you can say, you know, linear gradient, radial gradient, whatever, all right? So in this case, the brush, we just go in, remove that house, remove from porch, the windows, and we're good. Okay, so now, oops, should have gone out and go back. Turn the overlay off. Now I can take that section and make my modifications to just that localized area, right? And because I'm making modifications to my sky as well as that road, all right, I know that I can darken down that road a little bit, all right? Actually, that line there, okay? And at any point, if I want to add more or less, okay? All right, so maybe I want to exclude more of that road. I'm going to make my section a little less. There we go. Okay. So you can control how much of an area you want. All right. So now I'm going to add a new mask. All right. Don't use the add and subtract buttons down below here. All right. These here are for adding and subtracting to an existing mask, right? I want to create a new mask. I come to the top where it says create new mask, and I'm going to do another luminosity range. In this case, I'm going to select the dark area of the greens here, okay? And you can see that the light areas of green are selected as well, so I can come back to the right-hand side, right, and I want to less and less, all right, and I want to get more of just the darker areas of this image, okay? Really target that area there, okay? And my fuzzy slider, all right, control my edge transition. All right. Turn my show overlay off, and now I can make modifications. All right. So in this case, I want to darken those areas. All right. Darken the highlighted areas. Okay. Maybe even warm it up a little bit. All right. So now I can control just that section of the image luminosity wise. And then once I'm good, I hit done and we're good to go. All right. Actually, you know what? I think I'm going to darken down this street a little bit more. I'm back to my mask, create a new mask. I'm going to create a linear gradient. All right. Now the linear gradient works the exact same way. They just updated the look, right? So the linear gradient goes to 100% effect to 0%. So wherever you start your gradient, that's going to be your 100%, right? So I'm going to start down here all the way in the lower right-hand corner, and I'm going to drag up and across. So I want to select that road, and it's going to fade off. All right. So now you're going to notice here that the way it's represented is a little different than what you're used to. Previously, it was just 3 lines with a little pin circle in the center. Now they actually have the perpendicular directional line, and they've added handles. Let me put this up so you can see it. They've added handles here at the bottom, and you can see that this circle is in red, meaning that it's 100%. All right, and then this one up here is white, meaning that it's 0%. So we have the handles that allows us to expand and contract. And then we have this little thing that sticks out. That's for us to be able to rotate our effect. All right. But you can still come back to the center line here. And you can When you hover over it, you're going to see that it turns to that little double arrow. Click on it, and you can drag it up and down to rotate. The further away you are from that center point, the finer control you have over rotation, right? So if you want fine control, you want to be out here. If you don't want, you do this, it's going to be a little bit harder to control the closer you are to that pin, right? But you can click here on this handle, right? And even if you drag it out, you can control it, okay? Otherwise, it works the exact same way, all right? Turn my show overlay off. I'm going to bring my exposure down on that. Maybe lower the contrast. Maybe a little bit, there we go. All right. Maybe bring my saturation down a little bit on it. Okay. Not the best edit, but I'm not going for points on edit right now. Just want to show the tools. Okay. All right. And then, of course, the circular adjustment, or the radial gradient. Circular gradient works the exact same way. All right. So you can make your selection. All right. You can invert your selection. All right. You can control the, all right. So in this case, we have 100% effect going from our center point to this. All right. And we can just grab the pin and drag it. All right. So this is a nice upgrade to previously, because now we can definitely see visually modifying our mask, right? I say same. We can control the size. Okay. If you in combination with the Alt key, we could just Alt key will only otherwise by itself it's going to adjust from the center. All right, which for me works fine. I just make the general size, and then I will take it and I will drag it wherever I need it to be. Okay, and then of course if you want to rotate, you can come out just to the outside and you can rotate your mask. Okay. Or you can, let me bring this down, make it a little more obvious. You can come to this little outer pin here, the little hand, and click and drag it around. So other than the way it looks, the gradient and the radial filters pretty much work the same exact way. All right. All right. And if you don't want something, you just click on the ellipses and you say delete. All right. Any questions so far? I don't want to get too lost in this.
I have a question about an approach, and maybe I'm hung up on the sky thing, but for instance, suppose I wanted to work on that building specifically.
Yep.
Could I say, pick the sky, invert it, and then go in and subtract all the trees?
You could. That's a little bit of work.
Okay, all right.
All right. So I don't know if it'll work. Let me try. Okay. I just deleted all the masks. All right. We do have the select subject.
Okay, so I think the subject was doing some AI stuff and it wasn't working.
Typically, yes. All right. But you can see it did a fairly decent job here.
Never mind.
All right. Now, all right. You can see it's not perfect, but you saw how it can be modified. Okay. You just add and subtract whatever the AI can't handle or misses. You can modify it here. All right. But it tends to be a little tricky. Okay. So now, you discussed earlier the inverting a mask, right? Okay. So here we have a selection. It's not quite perfect, right? So now what we want to do is we want to come to this and we want to subtract using the brush these areas. All right, so I'm just going to zoom into this area. All right, and I'm going to refine my mask by erasing, whatever parts. Let me make my flow and everything 100% here. Okay. I'm just going to do a crude subtraction here. Oops. Yeah, be careful you don't grab your pen, otherwise it moves everything. All right. So I'm gonna you take your time, just like in Photoshop. You need to take your time with making your selections perfect. All right. It's no different here. All right. The only difference is the AI is going to get you fairly close. Fairly close. Not perfect, but fairly close. Okay. All right. And let me just take this section out. Good. Okay. So now we have our overlay. And of course, if I want to make it dark, all right, I can see, all right, where it missed some things. All right. So I might want to add to that mask, right? All right, so now, here's where it gets a little interesting, all right? If I go to the mask by itself, there is no invert button, okay? So I can't take this mask and say, hey, if I invert it, I can select everything around the house. There is no invert. Right? This is where it gets tricky. Okay? We have to go to our subject. And now when I click on the subject one, now my invert is there. Okay? But notice how it inverted just the original selection that the AI did. So you can see this tree here. Okay. All right. Because that tree is on a different one. All right. So I need to invert that, which inverts everything else. Right. So now it's only that little section that's selected. All right. And all this stuff here in the bush, if I go ahead and invert that. All right. This is one of the things I don't like about this particular system. You cannot invert the parent mask, and it's frustrating. So, if you want to invert, all right, you have to go back to your base selection, whatever that was, all right. And in this case, it was the subject, all right. Make a copy, all right. So duplicate mask one. All right, here, let me, just to keep it, let me make this house, all right. Oh, and I can spell, all right. I'm going to duplicate it, Okay, so house copy. So I'm gonna rename that everything else. Okay, because I want to invert it. Okay. Again, I can't invert it by itself. So all those modifications I did, I have to get rid of. I have to go back to my original subject. All right. And we'll go this way. Okay. And then invert it. All right. So now I have everything around it. And now I have to go in and make my modifications to this particular mask. Oops. Oh, that's right. Let me delete that. We're working on the inverse, so I actually have to add to the mask. All right. See, this, again, this is not where it's not intuitive like Photoshop. Okay. So I think overall they need to work a little bit on this. Hopefully, eventually they'll get it. All right. And then subtract. Oops. Add brush. What am I doing? Subtract. Brush. Is that what we're doing? Yeah. There we go. All right. So it's a little clumsy. All right, but it can be done. It can be done. All right, but as you saw, it's a hell of a process when you start making a lot of modifications to a mask. All right, because you're not working on a master mask like you are in Photoshop. All right, you're working on a collective of modifications to the mask. All right, and each modification combines with previous modifications in order to make that that full mask. All right, so yeah. Not the best, okay? But then again, this isn't Photoshop, all right? It was never designed to be Photoshop. So you have to understand that while the mask tool is pretty powerful and it does have, these limitations, it's not a replacement for Photoshop. It's to be able to allow you to do very quick, very dirty battlefield edits, all right, that don't require the finesse of Photoshop, right? And to be honest, the majority of the images that we tend to post don't require the finesse of Photoshop, all right?
That was my thinking, and I guess I didn't know if there was, maybe because I'm so new to Lightroom, but was there a capability to do this kind of thing even as rudimentary as it seems? I mean, selecting an object or subject, I guess. I wouldn't have asked the question if I understood subject to be any kind of subject.
Oh, right. Yeah, so obviously the AI is going to make a lot of assumptions as to what you are considering the subject. Okay. But, all right, hey, this may be a teachable moment when you edit. If you don't have a strong subject, it's not going to be able to figure out what it is you want edited. So it might say, hey, you're the photographer. What are you showing me here? I have no clue. All right. Yeah. So now you say, oh yeah, my subject isn't very strongly obvious, I need to rephotograph this, and in that case, you just scrap that line of thought and you go with the more traditional tools of the brush, the radial or the linear tool, right? So, okay, so you can see that we have problems here, okay, with this particular way of making a selection. So, is there a way that we can circumvent this? All right, so let's say I wanted to pick just this house, okay? Of course, I can come in and say, all right, I'm going to just paint this house, all right? But that gets a little bit tedious and monotonous, and especially anything that may have, some detail to it. All right, you can see that's definitely not a perfect mask, okay? And depending on the size of your subject in relation to your image, this may not be the best solution, okay? So one solution that I found previously that I'll be curious to see if I can work now is to use a radial gradient, okay? Make a selection just with my radial gradient that encompasses the majority of it, and then once I have that selected, go ahead and make a subtraction with my brush tool. All right, so it's kind of doing the opposite of painting in. In this case, I'm basically removing any external stuff. All right, and I find sometimes this is a faster method of making a mask. Now, obviously, I'm being, very quick and dirty here. Okay, but it allows me to make a good size selection very, very easily. And at that point, I do have my inverse, all right, except my inverse only goes to the edge of that circular gradient, okay? So, again, it's not the best solution, obviously. All right, but if you want to make a quick and dirty selection, that's one way of doing it. Okay. Any other questions? We're good. All right, guys. Like I said, I really didn't have a lot of time to play with these tools. All right, I'm sure there are some things that I've yet to discover that I will share with you as as I go along. All right, let me stop the share here.
Hey, Doug, quick question for you.
Sure.
Is this the update where my graphics card's not going to have enough memory?
I haven't heard of limitations on graphics card with Lightroom. I know Photoshop is the graphics card killer.
Gotcha. Because
Right.
You said that it was 4 and now it's 8, and mine only
No, it was 2 and now it's 4.
Oh, well then I'm okay.
Yeah, you should be okay for now. Now, that being said,
Yes, for now. I need to remember this.
yeah,
This one is old, and then I got this before I started doing photo processing, right? So
Right.
This was just like work with. Okay. So it needs a new one anyway, but I have to wait till we can get stuff, right?
yeah. Like I said, I've been shopping for a graphics card for this computer 3 months now, 4 months, pretty much since the middle of summer. Okay. And there were like zero, zilch, nothing. The Best Buy had, I think, like 2 or 3 on their shelves when I went there. All right. And places like Best Buy, Amazon, right? Newegg. You look up the graphics card that you need, it says out of order, or out of stock. You know, out of stock. And I'm like, So, which is interesting because there's a couple of tech guys that I follow on YouTube, and one of them says, "Hey, I found a solution to this out of stock graphics processor problem. Buy a cheap computer that's got a good processor and rip the processor out of that." And I'm like thinking to myself, that's an expensive way of getting a graphics processor.
Well,
But
it depends on how bad you want it, I guess.
yeah, that's it.
Maybe you could put the old card in that one and just use it and sell it for something else.
Use it as a junk computer somewhere, yeah.
Yeah.
But
Donate
no,
it, get it a tax receipt off it.
yeah. Now, I need a whole new computer anyway, so might as well. I just gotta bide my time when they become available.
Yes, me too.
So, in the meantime, I'm making my little shopping list. I think I'm gonna build my own this time around. Well, this one was built for me.
Yeah.
I don't think I've bought an off-the-shelf computer in like 25 years. Honestly.
Well, I do buy off the shelf, but I buy the biggest and the most expensive one I can afford at the time.
Yeah. You can't go wrong with gaming computers, and that's my laptop. My laptop, I have no skills to build a laptop. That's a little bit above my pay grade. So I bought my laptop. Oh Christ, it's got to be 10 years ago. It's old, I bought it from Digital Storm, and it was a 17-inch gaming computer, and it's got all the fancy LEDs, which I could care less about, But let me tell you, that little machine has been kicking ass all this time, and it's just now starting to get to the point where it's having trouble because, again, it's a 2 gigabyte graphics card, not a 4. So it's now having problems.
Yeah, I'm looking at. Somebody told me that if you're gonna buy off the shelf, buy a gaming one.
Yeah.
It's got the faster graphics for the games, right?
Yeah.
That's what I did with my last desktop that I had 2 years back. I had a guy built it, and he was a gamer. And because everything I told him I wanted for Photoshop, he goes, "I think you want a gaming machine."
Yeah. So
play games.
yeah, unless you can get a dedicated workstation that's designed for graphics or video editing. The only difference between those two systems is the gaming computer usually has the water-cooled fans and the RGB LED lights and, usually the quieter fans and the see-through cabinet, all that fancy stuff that, me personally, I could care less about fancy flashing lights and, all that stuff. So just as long as it can do the work that I need it to do. And as is evident, this machine is having a hard time doing it. It's struggling and needs a walker. So, anyways, guys, I appreciate you hanging out with me, and I appreciate your patience with me at the beginning. So, but hopefully you learned something.
Always, Duck, always.
Well, what are we going to do? Ask for our money back?
Well, we could. We can stop being Patreons.
Yeah, true.
Oh, wait, hold it. Okay. Thanks, Doc.
there is that, yeah.
See ya.
All right, guys, be good, be safe. We'll not next Monday, following Monday. All right. Ciao.
Thank you for watching Learning Photography with Duck. Brought to you in association with Milford Photo, your local full-service camera store. Located in downtown Milford, Connecticut, Milford Photo offers you a personalized shopping experience. From the latest camera gear to printing and framing services. And, of course, educational workshops to teach you the finer aspects of photography. Don't forget to tell them Duck sent you.